Thank you, Charlie, and thanks everyone for being here promptly after lunch. Hopefully we'll keep you alert and awake with this riveting topic on aligning retail rates with grid needs for flexibility and balancing considerations. We've got a great panel here today, and I'll introduce them each here in a second. But I guess I wanted to start off just by acknowledging the tremendous load growth that is anticipated in the electric sector as we look to electrify other segments of the economy. There was a presentation in the other session this morning by Jesse Jenkins, in which I think he talked about between a doubling and tripling of electricity demand by 2050. Separately, I saw a LinkedIn post from Elon, well, about a quote Elon Musk made yesterday at EEI, suggesting a tripling of electricity demand by 2045. And that's certainly very daunting from building the resources we need to meet that. But it also looks like a tremendous opportunity in terms of engaging that new demand to provide flexibility in the demand side in an unprecedented way. Our panelists today are going to talk a bit about that potential, which, interestingly, a lot of that is not weather correlated, so that creates some interesting opportunities to help solve some of the weather challenges we've been talking about in these sessions, perhaps, rather than exacerbate them. I think pricing is often looked at as or seen as a really efficient way to accomplish a desired economic outcome. Unfortunately, in the electric sector, that's not always realized the promise. So our panelists today will talk about some of the opportunities and what pricing can deliver, and how we can bring more load into the picture in terms of engaging it in flexibility, as well as some of the challenges in doing that. So our first speaker today is Eric Blank. He's the chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. So welcome, Eric.
Thank you. Again, my name is Eric Blank. I'm the current chair of the Colorado PUC. I've been in this job for about 2.5 years. Before that, I spent about 15 years running a national pioneering renewable energy company that I co-owned and co-founded. Among other things, at one point, we had the largest operating solar facilities in PJM, MISO, Georgia, and Colorado. And since I'm probably older than both Jesse Jenkins and Elon Musk, and my job will not go past 2030, I'm not going to be talking about 2045. I'm going to be talking about 2030 and what that means for Colorado. And I want to start off talking about the big picture. Under Colorado state law, regulated utilities are obligated to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2030 from a 2005 baseline. And we're going to do that by retiring a bunch of coal, replacing it with wind, solar, storage, demand side responsiveness, and some peaking capacity. And this is a bit of a stylized example, but the thing I'd highlight is that we have about over 4,500 megawatts of solar coming online, planned over 5,000 megawatts of wind, and the Xcel Energy Balancing Authority in Colorado has a coincident peak demand of under 9,000 megawatts. So by 2030, we'll have more wind and solar on the Colorado system than we have coincident peak demand. And obviously, when you look at our load factor over time, in many hours, we'll have way more wind and solar than we have actual demand. So just shifting the discussion from the resources to the available to peak demand. This graph shows the actual peak demand day in the Xcel Energy Balancing Authority in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. And historically, you can see that peak demand in Colorado occurs usually between 3:30 and 5:30. And if you tried to design time of use rates around that demand, it might look something like this, with a peak between 3 and 7 with shoulder periods on either side of it. So that's the peak demand. If you shift to energy, this is more national than Colorado, but this is from an NREL electrification future study from May of 2021. And what you can see is that industrial, residential, commercial demand, which is the red, orange, and green, is growing relatively slowly, at least in this one example, and that most of the growth is coming from electric vehicles with some significant uncertainty about how much that adds. So shifting to Colorado, our goal is to have just under 1 million EVs on the road by 2030. Currently, we have about 5.2 million cars, and we sell about 250,000 cars every year. And in the end of 2022, 10% of the new cars were electric vehicles. So to date, we have about 50, maybe just under 60,000 EVs on the road. So we're somewhere between 5 and 10% of our goal. And when you look at the slope with which EV sales are growing as a percentage of total sales, it's not unreasonable to think we can achieve that goal, which again is maybe 15 to 20% of the total cars. So if you just look at the size of a battery in my Tesla, for example, it's about 60 kilowatt hours. And if you multiply, and I guess a Ford 150, I think is like 150 kilowatt hours maybe. But if you take the lower end of that range and multiply it by the number of cars on the road by 2030, we expect that to be, roughly 56,000 megawatt hours. And if you try to view it as a utility resource, a 4-hour duration storage resource, and I don't even know what to call it, capacity, energy, storage, but whatever you call it, if you looked at that, it's about 14,000 megawatts of 4-hour duration storage. And again, remember the Excel balancing authority is 9,000 megawatts roughly. So we're going to have a set of batteries that are 50% greater than the entire coincident peak demand in the balancing authority by 2030. And if all those batteries charge during the system peak demand, however defined, we're going to have to, roughly double the generating base of the system. And if somehow we can use those batteries as a resource, it's enormously valuable. And I guess the point here is everything we're doing, resource planning, distribution system investment, load forecasting, all of it is enormously influenced by this. To put it in terms of dollars, when I was doing solar plus storage development, the cost of a battery storage we were bidding in was somewhere between $250 and $400 a kilowatt hour, all in upfront costs. And if you apply the lower end of the range to these batteries, the value of that for the electric system, just forget about transportation electrification. The value of this to the electric system is $14 billion. And that number is, again, 30% greater than the entire electric rate base of Xcel Energy in Colorado. So, putting aside the 2045, 2050 stuff, this is all 2030 in Colorado. And so it's an enormous potential impact to the Colorado system in both dollars and megawatts. And the question is, how do those costs and benefits get allocated? So these two graphs, the one on the left is a heat map of peak demand in Colorado, our highest day as a year or two ago, with months across the top and hours across the vertical axis. It's 12 by 24. And you can see the hottest days are when our load is highest. The second heat map is the 12 by 24 for a single axis tracker solar facility down by Pueblo. So just matching up peak demand versus solar output. And sort of trying to put this all together in this graph. So the dotted line is just peak demand sort of forecasted out to 2030. And again, like it is now, you can see it sort of peaks between 3 and 7 in the afternoon. The yellow is just, the yellow-orange is the amount of solar capacity we're expecting for 2030, as if it was 100% based on a single axis tracker in southern Colorado. So in reality, we'll have a bunch of rooftop solar and that pattern will be a little different. But that's the yellow. And then the dark black line is the peak demand net of solar, which is essentially, this is just the California duck curve, basically coming to Colorado. And what you see in terms of retail rates is that our current structure of defining on peak between 3 and 7 may be completely inapplicable as you look at peak demand net of solar. And increasingly, we think our highest loss of load probability, or are concerned that our highest loss of load probability may be between 7 and 8. And that's what we're already seeing in ERCOT and CAISO, where the highest loss of load probability is more like 8 o'clock. And if that's how this all plays out, we now have a set of time of use rates in Colorado that are incenting behavior of people to start charging their EVs when they get home at 7 o'clock, which is, if you picture thousands of megawatts coming online at our highest loss of load probability hour, it's going to be really problematic if it all plays out this way. So just want to conclude by saying a couple of things. For time of use rates, it needs to reflect where we're headed, not where we're at. As this big potential comes into the market, we just got to be really thoughtful about how we create the initial behaviors. I'd also say, from that first slide, we're going to have issues with solar and wind curtailment likely as penetration increases. And I think the most important takeaway of all this for me is, given the sub-hourly variability of wind and solar, at higher penetrations, we're going to need dynamic approaches for managing load and EV charging, right? Ultimately, we got to charge when the wind and solar are available, which is a problem you can't really get at with time of use rates. So I think in Colorado, which is a vertically integrated, regulated monopoly environment, somehow we're going to have to get a hold of and manage charging. And I don't know if it's through the OEM, through software providers, through charging providers, but we have to be able to do this in a dynamic way, or we're just going to, be overwhelmed in terms of distribution investment, resource planning, load forecasting. And I'd also say that in terms of implementing a dynamic approach in a regulated market environment, we're going to need new programs. The programs don't exist. We just need new ways of thinking about it. New program designs will likely be required, which is one reason I'm so interested to hear from my fellow panelists to see what the cutting edge on all of this is. And the last thing I'd say is that the economic value associated with getting a handle on this problem is going to be enormous. And in Europe, we're already seeing virtual power plants, private equity-backed businesses with billion-dollar-plus valuations, because they're able to aggregate up what's happening on that EV distributed solar side. And as a state regulator, I just say the more we can avoid privatizing those benefits, probably the better for customers. So we're going to need help. We're going to need competitive bidding. We're going to need the private market to help develop this. But I just hope we can do it through some form of competitive bidding or auction system, so we don't privatize too much of that $14 billion in value. And I don't mean to pick on private equity backed businesses. I ran 2 of them, but but we just have to make sure we do what's right for customers and all that. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Eric. That was really helpful setting the stage. And we are going to hear now from Bryan Hannegan, who is President and CEO of Holy Cross Energy here in Colorado. So welcome, Bryan.
Yeah, I think so. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to Obadiah and Charlie for inviting me to what, honestly, as a meteorologist turned utility CEO, is like my favorite, most catnip dripping conference of the year. And I also want to thank Chairman Blank for setting the table. His comments focused on the regulated side of the business in Colorado. I'm going to focus on the unregulated side of the business in Colorado. And in short, if you want to tune out for the next 10 minutes, my presentation is yes, more and faster. Because what he showed in terms of the portrait for what the state will look like in 2030, I'm going to show you in a moment, that's what we're going to look like as a cooperative next spring. And so these challenges are here and now, and I want to share with you some of the programs that we're doing with demand response and flexibility in action to try to get ahead of what we see as being this oncoming challenge of dealing with a system that is more driven by the weather, it's more driven by the climate, and we're actually being challenged now not to flex the generation to meet demand, but actually go the other way and flex the demand to meet the available supply from the wind and from the sun. So here's a little bit about Holy Cross Energy. We're one of 21 electric cooperatives at the distribution level here in the state of Colorado. We're only one of 6 utilities in the country that has a goal of supplying 100% clean electricity to our members by the end of this decade. And moreover, we'll be intending to be carbon-free across all of our scopes, both 1, 2, and 3 by 2035. So our area, because we're in the mountains of Western Colorado, our folks are very interested in a livable and sustainable environment. They partake in all the things that Coloradans prize, whether it's hunting, fishing, rafting, skiing, you name it, we do it. And so there's a strong environmental ethos, but we also recognize that that can't be done in a way that's irresponsible, that doesn't salute the age-old promise that the utilities provide of safely providing reliable and affordable electricity service to the members and the communities that it serves. You see there some of our stats on the right-hand side. We're about 1/20th or about 5% the size of Xcel Energy. So any of our numbers just multiply by 20, and that's an equivalent for an Xcel Energy, multiply it by 100, and that's Pacific Gas and Electric. We have 60,000 meters compared to their 6 million, to put it in perspective. At the end of last year, more than 50% of our power supply came from carbon-free resources on an annual basis. Going forward, by this time next year, that number will start with a 9. We'll be anywhere from 90 to 92% carbon-free on an annual basis in our power supply. And in any given hour, that will be between 60 and 100%. So we're already starting to get into what everybody else, and I wasn't here this morning to hear Jesse speak, but that last 10 or that last 20% challenge that we all talk about, our strategy has been to figure it out when we get there and to not let that be a barrier to doing the first 80% of the decarbonization challenge on the electric sector. Why? Because until we can decarbonize the electric system, we can't use that clean electricity to decarbonize heat or transportation or cooling or industrial process, the rest of the economy that if you're a climate scientist like me, you care about. And so we're a utility that's a little bit in a hurry. And our journey to 100% clean energy consists of a couple of different prongs. I'm going to talk today about the right side and not so much the left, but the left, the energy efficiency, the cleaner wholesale power, the local clean energy resources, that's what gets you to that 80 or 90%. But I'm going to argue for the next few minutes that that last 10 or 20% can only come from distributed resources and smart electrification. There's no other way to do it economically and reliably. And when you think about what we provide safe, affordable, reliable, and sustainable power. Those last 2 pieces are super important. And if you're not working on them right now as a utility, you are behind, in my opinion. And hopefully I'll convince you why. So we have a number of new resources developed or under contract, all of which will deliver sometime next year. Some of them, like the 5 megawatts of solar, the 4.5 megawatts of hydro, that first solar plus storage project, which is at the Colorado Mountain College campus in Glenwood Springs. It's DC coupled. It's a beautiful thing because you can fire solar to the grid. You can fire solar plus storage to the grid. You can fire the solar into the storage and leave the grid alone. You can throttle and brake just like a gas turbine. It is a beautiful thing. And it provides you with a great amount of flexibility at the distribution level. Cooperatives like the Kauai Island Utility Cooperative are using these technologies and actually adding wind and adding pump storage hydro to the mix to help run their transmission systems at very high levels of renewables. We want to do the same thing on the distribution side. And so when you look at our projected energy by fuel this time next year, will be, as I mentioned before, into the 90s. A lot of that coming from wind, a lot of it coming from solar, but we also have some other more base loaded renewables like biomass and hydro there as well. Here's the problem with that mix. Looks great in the annual, but when you project our hourly dispatch forward based on reasonable meteorological projections, for this day, and I picked May 19th of 2024, so just a few months away, you can see that for a large portion of our day, from about 10 a.m. to about 10 p.m., we are in an oversupply situation. And that's great if you have a wholesale market that's got a robust price that's a buy signal. But as you probably are aware, when most of us are in oversupply, that means our neighbors are too. And so syncing it to the wholesale market's probably not a viable strategy if it's your only strategy. And I personally, being a weather guy and being a power system manager, I cry when I see this because it's clean energy that I have already bought and paid for. And in many ways, I'm just tossing it away for a lower price, or I'm curtailing it, or I'm paying a penalty. I would much rather, in the spirit of integrated energy systems, find a place for that excess energy to live for a while until I need it later on in the afternoon or in the overnight hours. Colorado mountains, it gets kind of cold, even in the summer. People wake up, they turn their heaters on, they cook their breakfast, they get the kids off to school, right? How can we use the surplus during the peak solar or the peak wind hours and use it to fill in those gaps that the chairman showed and that I'm showing here? And so the emphasis for us as we go forward is not just more renewables, but more renewables paired with energy storage, more renewables paired with flexible load, the ability to shift the demand around so that the cars are charging when the sun is shining and not the other way around, right? And so that's our goal. And in fact, we've been studying this for years. RMI at their Innovation Center in Basalt has done some great work. They're a customer of ours as well as a collaborator of ours. You can look at how do you have smart buildings that can preheat and pre-cool and ride through the peak without any draw on the heating system? How can you use stationary batteries and also batteries on wheels to provide you that storage? The numbers that the chairman showed are amazing, and they're the same numbers that we see too. How do you get those cars to be available as grid resources that can provide services? And how do you set up both the communications and control mechanisms, but also the compensation framework that allows the consumer to go, you know what? I will wait a couple of hours to go to the grocery store because I can make a few bucks if my battery on my vehicle discharges to the grid right now, right? And how do we make that a decision that the human doesn't have to make, that the actual software can do for us? You know why? Because most humans I know, they don't want to optimize 14 energy apps. They want to go watch their kids play soccer or go recreate in the outdoors. They don't want to think about energy. In fact, when they do think about energy is usually when they hate me the most, and that's when the power's out. So we want to try to avoid that and run a power system that has tremendous flexibility. So for the last couple of years, we've been investing in some flexibility programs, pretty conventional. We have a peak time payback program where during that 4 to 9 p.m. window that is our peak, if we know that we're going to be hitting a coincident peak with the balancing authority, with PSCO, Public Service of Colorado, We'll call an event. We've got about 2,500 members enrolled in this. They get a text message, and for every kilowatt hour they save during that window, they'll save on their bill anywhere from 50 to 75 cents, maybe as high as $1.50. Our retail rate is 10 cents. So in that particular hour, they're making back 10 to 15 times what they would be paying to use the energy later on in the day. It's a pretty healthy incentive. And by the way, it saves us money too, because now we don't have to build a higher system peak with assets that are very lightly used the rest of the time. We do have time of use rates. We have the opportunity for people to opt into those. I will tell you, it's very lightly transacted, less than 100 members. And we have people that can be involved in this even with their batteries to use the arbitrage. 24 cents per kilowatt hour on peak, 6 cents in the off peak. Pretty good price signal, and yet 100 people. I'll come back to that in a moment. More importantly, we have what's called our Power Plus energy storage program, which over the last couple of years has allowed us to deploy 2.25 megawatts of behind the meter energy storage at our members, our customers, homes, and businesses. The cool thing here is that we're trying to solve the problem of equity by making it zero money out of pocket, 0% interest-free leasing program where you lease to own over a 10-year time frame. We've worked with our local installers to get them Tesla Powerwall certified, as you see here. We even pay a bill credit to the consumer in exchange for them allowing us to use the battery, not just for peak demand, but for things like voltage regulation and other grid services. The typical cost for one of those units fully installed is between $40 and $50 per month for 10 years. The consumer gets to use it for energy resilience and personal needs on blue sky days, and on black sky days when we need it for the grid. We've paid for that service, whether we've used it or not. And we're thinking about how we might extend this model to other distributed resources, to air source heat pumps and water heaters and even controllable managed vehicle charging because of the potential benefits that it provides to both the consumer and to the grid. And speaking of transportation, we actually hand out level 2 EV chargers. Anybody that wants them, full 100%, $650 rebate. All you got to do is tell us you're coming and we'll hand you 2 for your home or 4 for your business. Because what we determined was in order for people to drive electric vehicles, they needed to know where to fuel them. And while you could rely on the community network, you could rely on your workplace, you'd also be more inclined to buy an electric vehicle and drive electric and decarbonize that portion of your carbon footprint if you had a charger at home. And what's interesting is that we see from our perspective, the economics working so that after about 18 months, that $650 rebate has actually been paid back to us through the expanded use and the efficient use of our existing distribution network. We also support that by working with our communities to establish fast charging, where the first $150,000 of install costs are on us. If it's located in a place where we've assessed that our distribution system can better hold the load. And so you see there in the bottom left, a charger outside a shopping center in the town of Carbondale, where I live. And we're also reaching out to our transit authorities and to our school bus fleets, because these buses are about 1 megawatt hour apiece. It's like a hotel, but it's on wheels. And the funny part about it is it's parked most of the time where we need it the most. It's parked in the overnight hours when the wind is blowing and we need a place for that clean energy to go. And they're parked during the day, during the solar max, because the kids are in school. So they make great dump loads, if you will. I hate to use that term, but it certainly helps us balance out our system. And so we can offer incentives like time of use rates that are not in that 4 to 9 window, but they're actually during the period where the production is the greatest, those prices are the lowest. We've also dabbled a bit in virtual power plants. We have a 4-home affordable housing project with our local Habitat for Humanity chapter called Basalt Vista. This is actually 2019. This is old news. And what we're trying to figure out is how we can make every affordable house, or actually every house, to be honest with you, fit this model, to be able to operate individually, collectively, with a variety of distributed resources, with PV, with storage, with battery, with heat pump water heaters, air source heat pumps, with level 2 EV charging. How can these homes provide grid services? How can we pay our co-op members the things that we might go to the wholesale market or that we might go to a third-party provider for, and help keep those benefits in our community. The last thing I'll say as I wrap up, and I promised spicy, more spicy than lunch, is that we are now sitting in a world where our existing rates do not work any longer for the kinds of things that we're trying to do. And that when we are actively investing in self-generation, when we're actively investing in energy efficiency, we are eating away at the revenue requirement that we need to maintain the grid, because all of our revenue right now is coming from kilowatt hour sales. And what we proposed earlier in the year was to actually restructure our rates to try to capture that red piece in the middle, that delivery charge, separate and distinct from the energy itself. In other words, we wanted to become the FedEx of electrons, regardless of whether they're your electrons, your community's electrons, or electrons from a third party on the grid. Not surprisingly, because of the impacts that this has to a lot of conventionally held wisdom, we were asked to put this rate design on pause, and we've agreed to do so through the end of the calendar year. And we're looking forward to having some discussions about how we can have both investments in rooftop solar, but also a more reliable grid that is financially sustainable as well as environmentally sustainable. I'm happy to chat more about that during the question and answer period, but one of the points that I'll make here is if we're able to separate out the costs of the grid from the costs of the energy, then things like dynamic pricing become a lot more realistic for all parties to engage in. More dynamic price options reflecting the market, reflecting the need for grid services, and caps on net metered solar could in theory go the way of the dinosaur, which I think would be a good thing for the climate. So I'll look forward to the conversation and what I hope will be a spicy conversation going forward.
Well, I just want to thank you, Bryan, for getting people so riled up they ignored us for a few months. So greatly appreciate it.
That's right. At Holy Cross, our vision statement is we're leading the responsible transition to a clean energy future. In this particular case, we're leading with our chip. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bryan. That was great. Let's see, our next speaker is Dick O'Neill. He's going to be talking to us about extracting flexibility from price-sensitive loads through bid and demand. And this was one of the papers, if you are on ESIG's email or on our LinkedIn or Twitter, that was highlighted as part of an 8 white paper series from one of the task forces that is part of our both our DER working group and system operations and market design working group. So we've had quite a bit of discussion on this pricing topic, and Dick's got a really thought-provoking set of slides for you here today. Dick is a distinguished fellow at ARPA-E.
Thank you. It's nice to be here today. If I lose my voice, I apologize. I'm getting over a bout with bronchitis. By the way, nothing that I say today would be against whatever I've heard so far. It would enhance the programs that are existing. And that is essentially taking the flexibility that demand has, natural flexibility, and using it to move power or move consumption of power to where the prices are low, which happens to be where the renewables are high, and moving it away from the peak. And so all of these programs one of the interesting things about the bid and demand program is it almost combines all of the existing programs into one piece. Now, 20 years ago at FERC in a NOPR dubbed the standard market design, we proposed to do something like this, but the NOPR never got to a rule status, so it didn't happen. Now, if you look at the electric market, the ISO markets today and the imbalance markets, we're really only halfway there. There's less than 3% of the demand that participates in the market. And we've gotten a very long way with only half of the market participating. So think about what the power of the rest of the market participating in moving the power and moving the consumption around to where it's optimal, that is the least cost for consumers and most profitable for generators and most profitable for industrial consumers. There are a lot of controversy around demand programs, none of which I mean to talk about today in any detail. But almost all of them have prices that are what I call stale. Time of use prices go into effect, they stay in effect, and they probably long outlive their usefulness in a lot of cases. You know, as the chairman said earlier, you set them at one period of time and all of a sudden you realize the peak has moved. This is a dynamic process, bid and demand, where the process happens every day. You move people to the peak prices, not the peak prices, sorry, the cheap prices, and you get time of use pricing on the peak and bring the peak down. Now, bid and demand doesn't suffer from a lot of issues that DR programs do. There are no baselines. The prices are stale. As a matter of fact, the consumers that are participating actually are part of the price formation process. And very importantly, I held my questions back this morning. The consumer value is not the cost of a combustion turbine. I don't even, although most people in the business have simply bought into that assumption, I challenge anybody to tell me why I would value consumption in my house at the level of the cost of a combustion turbine. But that's essentially the working hypothesis assumption that we use. Now, for industrial customers of electricity, this doesn't look very much different than our generators. Industrial customers are selling product. They have a profit equation, and they should know the price at which consuming electricity would no longer be profitable. And if they don't know that, they should probably go home and do the calculation now. And if you can do that, you can bid into the market successfully. And anyone who bids into the day-ahead market is guaranteed a hedge against the real-time market prices and a profitable experience if they're chosen. Skip over. But there are tensions. In industrial customers, plant operators prefer steady state operation. I've talked to quite a few of them. They love to run the operation flat out all the time. They don't care. They don't want to care about prices, and they don't care about prices. You talk to the financial people, and you tell them they'd be better off if they move their power around where the prices are right. They're very excited. But the interesting thing is, in a lot of these industrial firms, the energy management is not a high priority. It is oftentimes moved to headquarters. What I hope to convince you of, although I don't have enough time to present enough information, is that the market, the economy, the environment are all better off when the demand side participates, and the more the merrier. Consumers are better off and more profitable. There's no need for ISO for consumers to give control to the ISO. Yes, in some cases you would voluntarily give control to the ISO, but it's not a forcing mechanism. The same rules apply to generators as apply to demand. Generators are not, no ISO has a switch where they can turn a generator off or on. And the same is true for consumers. And prices become crowdsourced. They become a function of the demand side bidding and the supply side bidding. I'll skip over this in the interest of time. There's a long history of demand response programs. They've been around for over a century, and they haven't changed very much. We debate, how to calculate them and things like that, but they're based. I found out a couple of months ago that the program that my parents were on in the 1960s still exists today at Baltimore Gas and Electric. In the 80s, FERC decided to re-examine their approach to regulation, and it ended up that by the end of the 80s, we had required open access to natural gas. It worked fairly well, so we decided to require open access to the electric system. Some of the power pools protested, so we created an ISO option which would satisfy open access. The design criteria, and I'll just list these here. The interesting things that often don't appear in these lines is we honor the physics. The ISO's markets basically try to track the physics as closely as possible. But these markets are non-convex. Also, we want good price signals to signal entry and exit. Now, electricity markets started about 25 years ago, and they didn't start with where they are today. In PJM, they started off with an auction market where they allowed bidding for generators and forecast demand for consumers. They used a technique called Lagrangian relaxation to dispatch the system. They very quickly learned that they didn't have enough zones in the market, and their market actually failed. But they realized, because there was a long debate about zonal versus nodal pricing, quickly switched to nodal pricing, and the problem went away. Just the opposite happened in California, where the power market failed and sort of went out of business. But still, there was no demand side. And because there was no demand side, the pricing had to create, we had to create administrative prices. And by the way, ISOs are voluntary, but if you look at this map, they almost cover the entire United States, or are about to cover, although I'm only allowed to say imbalanced market, I'm told. But you can see that these markets are very popular. And you don't really volunteer for unpopular markets. At the heart of these markets are two markets. One, a day-ahead market that financially hedges you against the real-time market. And the interesting thing about this is it schedules you into the periods of low prices. And these prices are guaranteed if you can actually perform as dispatched. In the real-time market, you can decide to buy more or less depending on what the price is. There are capacity markets and transmission markets, which I'll discuss later. The capacity markets have a very bad pedigree. They were designed because of the missing money problem, which was, I would argue, part of the missing bid and demand problem. And we have always had a problem debating what the capacity really is, because generators fail with certain probabilities. And now we see a massive issue of what the capacity of generators are. There is, in theory, there is no need for a capacity market. Now, in the future, and you've heard it from the people here already today, we expect more renewables, we expect more flexible consumption devices, and we expect more extreme weather. And reliability and resilience, in my opinion, are part of efficient system operators, because if the system fails on a regular basis, it's hard to argue that it's efficient. Now, bid and demand can help all of these problems. I'll skip over these. We need to change our vocabulary. Up in the corner here is Sister Euphemia, my 8th grade teacher, giving us a vocabulary lesson. I don't have enough time to go through these. So as I said early on, we're only halfway there. And the best way to go about doing this, in my opinion, is to give the consumers access to the generator model in the market and allow them to use it. There's very little participation today, and most DR programs get very little participation to our off-peak consumption, which is where we're curtailing renewables, and we don't want to be curtailing renewables. There are lots of studies on DR programs. Some people think most of them are inefficient. See, I've already said a lot of this, so I'll skip over that. A lot of consumers, and I've talked to quite a few, don't understand bid and demand and don't understand how to bid into demand. Not bidding into these markets could be considered greenwashing if you're fairly large. What has to happen is whatever the barriers to participation, they need to be lowered. I'm not even sure what they are. And you achieve bid and demand with a carbon tax achieves both goals: cleaner environment and more efficient electricity. Now, and all of this is going to be absolutely necessary when the system is what, 3 times larger than it is today? And so to me, yes, we could probably get there by loading up on storage, but storage is expensive. It produces no energy, it consumes no energy. It just simply stores energy for a short period of time. Utilize the flexibility of the demand side to create better benefits for the entire system, including the customers themselves. I'll skip over. With that, I think I'll just call it quits for.
Great, thank you very much, Dick. A lot to think about there in terms of getting to that other than 97% of the demand that is not bidding in. Our last speaker today is Tom Hines. He is a consultant to Arizona Public Service. He's going to be talking to us about orchestrating customer programs and rates for a customer-centric path to clean energy.
Thanks, Obadiah. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here today. As Obadiah said, my name's Tom Hines. I'm a founder and principal of Tierra Resource Consultants. I've been a long time internal consultant to APS since 1997, where we've really helped them work through everything from customer programs to how to take advantage of customers that are on time differentiated rates. APS, I'll be talking about how APS has a very large percentage of customers that are on time differentiated rates and how we're trying to orchestrate between rates and programs to produce what we call a customer-centric path to clean. I'm hoping this is my, is that too advanced? There we go. All right, so first, I just wanted to give a quick definition of what we're talking about when we say customer-centric or customer-focused demand management. With customers being kind of in the center of this equation, all of the speakers really have talked about the principles or pillars for utilities these days: affordable, reliable, safe, and clean. And so our customer-focused approach really starts with that as the tenet, which is what we've heard consumers, our ratepayers, asking for. But trying to do it in a way that helps bring all consumers along, so access to all, and do it in a way that we like to think of as frictionless. So easy to enroll, easy to find out about programs, and value and participation in programs. And we really take that very seriously, and I'll talk a little bit about how we design our programs and communicate with customers a little bit differently to ensure that we're really focused on this as our goal in the way that we design and implement our programs. So kind of 3 main approaches that we use to drive customer load flexibility. The first one being what I call kind of old school load management, which is consumer behaviors. But today, I think a lot of those consumer behaviors, while being manually implemented, can be actually signaled and triggered by technologies. Great example is we now have rebates for home energy management systems. We have a lot of consumers that are on not only time of use rates, but demand-based rates. They've opted to be on those rates. And we're big believers in awareness, matching the right rate to the right customer lifestyle, some enabling technologies that help make that rate easy to work around, and just, you know, help with affording the upfront cost of those enabling technologies. So when we think about this, we're trying to seed some of that awareness and behavior through technologies like home energy management devices that are giving proactive messaging around our on-peak rates that say, hey, this is a good time to shift your energy use and save some money. Of course, direct dispatch, we've talked about it, demand response, and all the different ways that we're doing more direct dispatch of customer devices and customer loads. And then finally, the one that we never forget about is rate responsiveness. And how do we use all of these to help, number one, support each other to make sure that we're being clear with consumers about which program they're in and which program they're not in. For instance, which is an on-peak day versus a demand response event day, things like that. But also really trying to recognize that a lot of these are all rowing in the same direction for a consumer, and we can use them to kind of back each other up in terms of messaging and also in terms of customer value, and I'll talk about that. By the way, I have a ton of material I wanted to share with you guys, so I'm going to go fast. First of all, I have to do this because a lot of people go, okay, so for the 5 or 10% of your customers who are on TOU rates, that's not the case with APS. I think this group, some of you are aware of this, that both APS and SRP, the two utilities that serve the Phoenix metro area, have 2/3 to 3/4 of all residential customers have voluntarily enrolled in opt-in time of use and even time of use plus demand rates. They've been marketed for many, many years. They were called the air conditioning rate in the 70s and 80s, as a lot of homes in the desert were being converted from evap cooling into refrigerated cooling. And so that created quite a peak, in, as you can imagine, in the desert. And so this has been something that we've been building since the 1980s, and have consumers that by and large understand the rates, understand how they can save on the rates, and actually wouldn't want you to take their time of use rates away from them. We believe that these price signals are actually helping encourage customer investments in distributed energy resources that not only help them manage their costs, they get a daily price signal and a sort of rate arbitrage that allows them to say, wow, that battery really makes sense for me to invest in today. That provides additional help for us to grow our programs. And so that's one of the ways that we think that these are actually working really, really well together. We try to really align clean, affordable, and reliable, and I'll show you how we do that across our programs and our demand response events and the way we think about our events. And we always do them in a way that what we call holds harmless, a customer who's on a time of use rate, so that any additional load flexibility that we're trying to get of dispatching devices does not adversely impact someone's bill. And that's not always an easy task. So this one on the right, what you see is actually the APS kind of basic, 12 by 24 of the APS time of use saver's choice rate that not only has, number one, it has the same on peak. That's partly just because of the climate in Arizona, same on peak hours all year. That's super helpful for customers to help them manage around. But then we've also, for non-summer months, this is the first time APS has instituted a midday super off-peak rate. So what we're really trying to encourage is not only load shifting, but load shifting to this time in the middle of the day, not to after the peak, but to before the peak. So it's really interesting, and I'll show you how we're doing that and using it to drive value and to drive decarbonization. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we lean in with customers on education around the value of TOU, which also helps to educate them about the value of peak and managing the peak for everyone, for all customers. So this is something that we developed along with Oracle O-Power called the Rate Plan Coach. And it's a really cool kind of gamified way What this is a weekly communication with customers on specific rates. So we have a TOU rate plan coach, we have a demand rate plan coach, and then we actually do have a flat bill rate plan coach also. But the TOU rate plan coach, what it does is it says, here's how you did last week. Here's some tips for how you could do better this week in shifting your energy off peak and saving money. If you follow these, then you get to see at the end of that week how well you did, and then some more tips for the following week. So it's a series of 4 communications over a month. We do kind of 6-month campaign where we target customers and help educate them and make them aware of their rate and how to save on it. In addition, what we do is promote enabling technologies they can use to manage their rate and also use to enroll in our demand response programs. And this is just a cool slide to show you that customers are responding to rates. As a matter of fact, we had CAISO call us and say that they thought that our load information was wrong because there was such a distinct difference between an on-peak and an off-peak day. So we have off-peak on weekends, and they were saying, boy, your loads are not looking right. And this is because we have really well-designed TOU rates that are really getting customers to respond. This is not a demand response day. This was a TOU day. This was just an on-peak day. And this is telemetry data from thousands of thermostats that we get from the Energy Hub platform. So these are our more engaged consumer because they are enrolled in our program. But you can see where there's a significant load adjustment that's being made by the consumer on their own. We help them with videos, with virtual installs, with teams that can help them kind of set up how to run their thermostat to take advantage of this pre-cool before the on-peak period. But what we see is that by and large, way more customers than the ones that we are directly touching are able to get this and are really, really giving us some very reliable demand response, but rate responsive demand response. In addition, we've talked about the limitations of TOU rates, right? They are inherently limiting in terms of their granularity and the flexibility and the static nature of them. So what we've done is built a very large aggregated DER device program or set of programs in kind of building a virtual power plant across these. I won't go into all the details, but close to 200 megawatts that we've developed. We were about 20 megawatts in 2017. So we've developed about 180 of these megawatts in the last 5 years. Most of the results and examples I'm going to give you today are the thermostat program. You'll see that's the vast majority of this today, more than half of that capacity. But we are quickly building battery capacity, connected water heater capacity. I don't have EVs on here because they're really small right now, but that's kind of the next frontier. So all the things we were talking about. And what we're seeing is the need for longer demand response periods. And so needing to look at those other devices. One of those that I wanted to touch on really quickly is in our multifamily program. Again, one of the ways that we're trying to bring the benefits of storage and load shifting to a renter who doesn't necessarily have the incentive or upfront investment to install this, right? And so we are doing this with property managers. We're installing them in all units. We are really putting flyers out, encouraging customers to adopt a time of use rate. These are not controlled through demand response events. They're actually optimized each day, learning algorithms that optimize to a customer's use to keep them in hot water, number one, most important thing, but also save them energy, so about 4 or 5% energy efficiency, and then shift load around TOU rates. And we're seeing maybe $15 to $20 in just the load shift, another $30 or so in energy efficiency, a $50 savings for a consumer. They often don't even know that it's happening. They typically don't. We're also able for property managers to pre-identify leaks before they cause insurance claims. It's the #1 insurance claim for rental properties. So property managers love this for non-energy efficiency reasons as well. Back to kind of how are we integrating demand response and time of use? One of the things that we just actually did this year, we're trying to share with consumers more communications about why we do demand response events and sort of a pledge or a promise to consumers around some things like, #1, here's why we're doing events. They're for reliability, affordability, and clean. #2, We conduct events in a way that tries to preserve comfort for residents as much as possible and participants. We want you to be comfortable. And anytime you're not comfortable, we encourage you to opt out of events and want you to know that you are always in charge of your own thermostat. That is something that we heard loud and clear from consumers over social media. So we've really responded by saying, hey, let's make sure that get through the noise. This is how we're running the program. We assume all participants are on a TOU rate. Remember, we have 70% of all residential households on a TOU rate. They switch. We've been concerned about not getting this right. So right now we're assuming everybody's on TOU. We'll probably try to innovate that a bit in the future. And so we're building DR designs that work around our TOU rates. So what does that mean? We've peaked on a weekend before, so we really do weekend DR events. We address TOU snapback. Our time of use period was changed to 4 to 7 p.m. And we've got major concerns about the 7 to 8 p.m. hour. So we're often using demand response events at the end of that period. And then other non-peak operational needs, which is really where we're going in the future, is low load conditions and serving the operation side. All right, I got to keep moving because I got a few more slides I want to cover. We do a lot of load shaping, gaps in event pre-cooling, gaps between pre-cooling and event times, throttling thermostats in and out of events, staggering when they participate, doing things called firm load dispatch, end time randomization, just a bunch of creative ways to try to shape this load as much as possible around grid value and consumer value. One of the ways and one of the metrics we use is around carbon intensity. This I'll quickly share is what we predict our marginal and carbon intensity looks like by month, by hour on average next year. And you can see, and I'll show you because it's hard to see these numbers, between the trough and the peak, it's a 3x difference in marginal carbon intensity. Wow. The same exact action from a consumer has 3 times the carbon value when we time it right. And so you'll see where I slotted in those time of use hours. They're super well aligned to carbon intensity, particularly when we're thinking about load shifting to prior to the peak period. You can see where that really, really has an impact. And here's where we show it in an actual event for smart thermostats and demand response, where we did pre-cooling, we did a bit of a gap before the peak period, and then we did setback. And you can kind of see each one of those little chunks, right? So there's that pre-cool where we actually increased carbon a bit. But then there's all the carbon savings during that period where we had a pre-cool, then we had a gap, then we did a setback, then a bit of a snapback at the end of the event. The net, when we look at this based on current marginal carbon intensity, is about 1/3 kilogram of carbon savings per thermostat per event. So this is what load shifting can do when we think about it that way. And we're getting reliable load reductions. This was the best example I could give everybody. It's a couple years old. It's from 2020 when there were rolling blackouts in the state of California. We had to call 4 events over a 5-day period. Temperatures in Phoenix Metro were between 110 and 117 for each one of these events. Our load forecasting group, our resource planners, were really concerned about fatigue. What we saw was very consistent response. You see higher response on the 15th. That was a weekend. And we were able to pre-cool right before the event because we had no TOU rates to deal with. So higher per unit KW there. But you'll see where we saw very consistent response. And our forecast for this were within a couple % of actual, even though we let consumers opt out, and this isn't completely firm. So we're doing a good job of kind of managing the forecasting and the reliability of it. We also do a good job of doing post-event surveys with a random selection of customers, and then post-season surveys with all customers. I know I'm out of time. So a couple of things about key elements that we are thinking about when we're trying to integrate and orchestrate between TOU rates and demand response. First is, don't shy away from customer engagement interaction. Sometimes I think utilities tend to say, like, get a customer involved in DR and then like be quiet about it because we don't want them to think about it too much. We don't want them to unenroll. But we've kind of taken the opposite approach and tried to drive awareness and reasons for participating and really integrate the messages around clean, affordable, and reliable. Carefully design our strategies so that we can say to customers, if you're on a TOU rate, DR actually helps you on your bills. But also understanding as we get into things like critical peak pricing, avoiding double compensating for the same service. And that's where things might get complicated in the future. Supporting customer adoption of enabling technologies that help them with both daily load management as well as peak event load management that we can utilize in demand response events. Help them in proper setup and configuration. This is a big deal. It's easy for a customer to sign up and get involved and then never put the thermostat on their wall. And a lot of utilities have a lot of thermostats sitting on desks right now. And then use all the things we can do to inform this strategy: device telemetry, AMI data, consumer surveys. Some challenges to this approach. Baselines, Dick talked about them. Maybe someday we won't need them, but we do right now in our current program design. And TOU makes it look like demand response is less valuable. But we need to take a different perspective and say, no, it's actually the combined impact. And let's look at a customer who's not participating in either compared to a customer who's really giving us what we need. Again, need to ensure as we get more complicated with rates and compensation and rates that we're not double compensating for the same service. We need to think about that. Protecting TOU rate impacts does limit the flexibility of what we're allowed to do with DR. But so far, we've been able to work around it for the benefit of customers in the grid. And I think orchestrating across multiple DERs is kind of our next step for getting there. We've been concerned about potential customer confusion. We've seen it from thermostats that sometimes do their own peak management events and things that have nothing to do with the utility. And a lot of times we'll get complaints from consumers saying, you didn't tell me there was a demand response event today. It's actually a thermostat event. Not initiated by the utility. And then, you can get higher potential fatigue from DR events, but you can also get consumers kind of structured in a way that they get how to shift load in their homes and do it comfortably for their families. 2 more slides and then I'm going to run. Advantages provides economic signals. And what we've seen is that's encouraging investment in DERs for customers. Encourages or enables better payback for customers from participation in both TOU and DR, as well as EE packages. We do a lot with our home performance contractors to try to get not only energy efficiency and enabling devices installed, but get the consumer on the right rate and program those devices to give them additional savings, way quicker paybacks for energy efficiency projects. So we're always trying to drive like increased value from not only TOU, but also DR. And trying to help kind of support each other, right? So that's where we think the advantages are. Few lessons learned really quickly. I told you I was going to cram a lot in. It's my last slide. So customers, allow DR opt-outs, particularly for like your residential customers, certainly not commercial and industrial. Clear messaging, we just talked about. Sell the bundled value, EE, TOU, DR. It's a lot quicker payback for customers, a lot more enticing. For our aggregator partners, we've learned how to build stronger service level agreements and LDs and things into contracts, even when customers have opt-outs, and there's ways to do that. With our OEM partners, careful coordination messages help with install and provisioning of devices. All our incentives, how we design our incentives, right? Use both value streams, but also we're now timing our annual incentives very carefully after we, what I call cull the herd from consumers that aren't giving us any value. Some of these thermostats aren't connected for months at a time, and we actually have to de-enroll those customers. We try to keep them engaged, and then finally we say, you're not going to get your next incentive. So we've been careful about how we design that, and then careful evaluation to try to figure out how the attribution and how all these impacts work. With that, I will turn it back over. Thank you guys for listening. Appreciate it.